This video is sponsored by Skillshare. More about them later. You see the title? Welcome to the second alternate history video of Casual Historian. In the first video, we asked what would have happened had the Ottoman Empire stayed out of World War I. Well, this time we're asking, what would have happened if the Nazis and the Soviets hadn't signed their non-aggression pact in 1939? To get that, we need to cover some history.
Prior to the rise of the Nazis, Weimar Germany had close ties with the Soviet Union. They became close trading partners in 1924 when the rest of Europe was trying to hobble together a new gold standard with the US. Germany bought raw materials from the Soviet Union, and the Soviets purchased capital goods and hired German engineers to teach the Soviets how to use them. They also established tank production factories in Leningrad. The Soviets not only had German engineers designing and building new tanks in the Soviet Union, but also had German tankers being trained in the Soviet Union. But this relationship extended past economics. Throughout the 1920s, the German and Soviet governments had talked about carving up Poland between the two of them, and the rest of Europe feared the growing ties between them. Some believe that admitting Germany into the League of Nations in 1926 was intended as a means of breaking up the relationship. The ascension of Adolf Hitler to power in 1933 did sour relations between the two, but that had begun in the late 1920s. When Joseph Stalin consolidated power after Lenin's death, he ordered German communists to cease cooperation with the Social Democrats, often referring to them as social fascists. At the time, Stalin believed that Western capitalism was in crisis and on the verge of collapse, so he didn't want to do anything he thought would restore stability. In another break with Germany, the Soviets established a non-aggression pact with Poland in 1931 and another with France in 1932.
Some historians argue that Stalin intentionally destabilized German politics in order to aid the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. However, these are arguments mostly based on circumstantial evidence. Rather, the rise of Hitler mostly sped up a process that was already underway. Under Hitler, Germany would sign its own non-aggression pact with Poland in 1934.
Germany created the anti-Comintern Pact with Japan in 1936. By 1936, Germany was facing a crisis in the supplies of raw materials, to which he decreed his own 4-year plan to rearm at any cost. By the time the non-aggression pact was signed between Germany and the Soviets, both were in dire straits. Under Hitler, Germany had gradually eroded away at the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, such as reoccupying the Rhineland and remilitarizing. They had also begun territorial expansion into Czechoslovakia and then into Austria. The Germans had their eyes on Poland again, despite their non-aggression pact signed 5 years earlier. The shortage in raw materials in Germany was a growing problem that their international isolation hadn't helped. The Soviets were also in a bind. Not only had their plan to try to unify all of Europe against Germany not work, they were now being isolated themselves. They also needed access to German arms and expertise. Germany wanted to invade Poland, but Britain and France had drawn a red line at the Polish border.
Now, neither of them actually wanted to go to war. They were trying to bluff Germany. But it didn't work.
The two signed a non-aggression pact that carved up Eastern Europe. Hitler wanted to avoid a two-front war, and thanks to the purges of 1937 and 38, the Soviets were in no condition to go to war at that time. They both knew that this peace was temporary. After all, the treaty explicitly stated that the time limit was 10 years. The main difference is that Stalin thought it would last longer than it had. After Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939, the French and British were forced to live up to their promises and declare war on Germany. However, they couldn't send reinforcements to Poland, and they didn't bother trying to attack Germany from the west, allowing Poland to get swallowed up by the Germans and the Soviets. In 1940, the Germans would invade much of Western Europe, while the Soviets claimed territory in the Balkans, Baltics, and Scandinavia. But after a year of unsuccessfully trying to get the British to surrender, the Nazis turned their eyes eastward and invaded the Soviet Union, dooming Germany to defeat.
When you begin to look at the history, you realize that the Soviets and Stalin have a lot of culpability in the rise of the Nazis and the start of World War II. If it wasn't for Stalin giving the order to German communists not to work with the Social Democrats, they could have formed a united front against the Nazis. The non-aggression pact not only gave Hitler the raw materials he needed to build the machines of war, but it also politically secured his Eastern Front, allowing him to invade the rest of Europe. Joseph Stalin and the Soviets were the first Nazi collaborators, and without them, the history would have gone significantly different. And I'm going to talk to you about that. But first, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is the all-in-one learning platform that has become a regular part of my creative life. Every video, every week, I'm trying to do something a little better on these videos. And Skillshare is one of the ways I learned how to do all of these things better. If, like me, you're trying to become a professional creative type, then I suggest watching a series of courses created by Thomas Frank on Skillshare. Thomas Frank is a YouTuber with a productivity channel, but he also has several courses on Skillshare which are definitely worth a watch, that are definitely a bit more boiled down to what you actually need. But if you also need very technical skills, they also have that. They have stuff for coding, filming, using different editing softwares, and even stuff for non-creative types. They have stuff for dieting, cooking, meal planning, and all sorts of new things that you might find useful in the new year. And I've got a special offer for you, because you see, the first 1,000 people to click the top link in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. A year subscription is only $100, so it's definitely worth the value. But if you want to try it out before then go ahead and click that link in the top of the description. We'll give you a free trial to Skillshare Premium. Watch as many courses as you want, get some knowledge, learn some new skills for the new year. Thanks to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. And now, back to the history. So let's say that in August 1939, Joseph Stalin doesn't sign the non-aggression pact with Germany. What happens next? Well, I imagine 3 potential scenarios.
Having been politically blocked in the east, Hitler can't afford to invade Poland. Although the Soviets are in a weak position militarily, they don't want Hitler to invade Poland unilaterally. The Nazis want to push their frontier as close to Moscow as they can. If Germany invaded Poland without the pact, the Soviets would intervene on behalf of Poland and probably take a chunk of Polish territory as compensation. Hitler is aware of this, so invading Poland by himself is off the table. That leaves Western Europe. On the one hand, invading Western Europe without a political guarantee from the Soviets is dangerous, but a war breaking out between Germany and the rest of Western Europe was Stalin's plan in the first place. He believed that the capitalist countries would eventually turn on each other, and after they had weakened each other, the Soviets could come rolling and defeat them all, leading to Soviet-style communism dominating Europe. So if the Germans declared war on France and Britain unilaterally, Stalin would keep the USSR on the sidelines until it looked like an easy victory for them.
But how effective it could be depends entirely on how quickly the sides can prepare. If Germany tries to move units too quickly from the east to the west, that means the Allies will get anxious and prepare faster themselves.
There's also the question of the Maginot Line, a string of French fortifications along its border with Germany. In our timeline, the Germans avoided colliding directly with the line by going through Belgium, just as they did in the First World War. There had been plans for the Belgians to construct a similar line along their border with Germany, but it was never built. The French could have extended their line up to the English Channel, but they feared doing this would signal to the Belgians that they were planning to abandon them to the oncoming Germans, which might push them into the Nazi camp.
So let's say that Hitler decides to take his time and postpones any invasion of Western Europe until 1940, giving both sides time to gradually build up. He eventually does attack, and it's slower than in our timeline, but still fairly quick.
They manage to overwhelm France in about the same amount of time, and are stuck trying to fight the British, who, like in our timeline, are stubbornly resistant. At this point, one of two things happens. Either the Soviets decide to attack Germany from the east, or the Americans eventually join the war in the west, and potentially both. The later the Soviets stall their entry into the war, the better their post-war situation will be, because in our timeline it took a long time for the Soviet Union to recover from the war, due to most of the active fighting taking place on their territory.
Regardless of when each thing happens, the Nazis are still destined for defeat.
The long-term scenario for this timeline is that the Cold War still happens, but with a much stronger Soviet Union, and the Iron Curtain coming down further west. In this timeline, I doubt Italy joins up with Germany in the war. I see Mussolini either staying out of the war, or even possibly joining the Allies in hopes of obtaining some territory from Austria. In this scenario, Germany is still going to move eastward, but instead of attacking Poland, Hitler instead decides to pull Poland and as many other countries in Eastern Europe as he can into the anti-Comintern Pact. In our timeline, the anti-Comintern Pact began to take on a more anti-Western role after the molotov-ribbentrop Pact, which resulted in Japan distancing itself from the anti-Comintern. Without that pact, it remains primarily an anti-Soviet alliance. In this scenario, Hitler tries to lead an anti-Soviet crusade sometime in the early 1940s. At this point, it becomes a question of whether the Western powers would be willing to intervene. Since Germany and the anti-Comintern would be the aggressors, it would be politically infeasible for France, Britain, or the US to side with Hitler. However, Britain and the US couldn't side with the Soviets either. France, on the other hand, might be willing. I also see Hitler losing in this scenario as well, but without the US insisting on unconditional surrender, we might see Germany throw its anti-Comintern allies under the bus in order to preserve its own regime. So we would see the boundaries of the Soviet Union extend into the Baltics, Poland, and the Balkans. France probably also tries to detach the Rhineland from the rest of Germany, most likely turning it into a puppet buffer state. After that, I can see either a coup taking Hitler out of power or an eventual Soviet invasion. In our timeline, the United Kingdom refused to surrender to Hitler. Churchill and the British attribute this to their sternness and resolve. But Hitler attributed this to the looming presence of Russia.
Hitler believed that so long as the Soviet Union could potentially enter the war, the British would hold out.
Given this, Hitler thought the only way to make the British surrender would be to knock out the Soviets, thereby eliminating any hope for aid from the continent. On top of this, Hitler would have to eventually go east in order to claim his desired Lebensraum.
In our timeline, the Nazis and the Soviets were both planning for war with each other even after the pact was signed. Given the ideologies and personalities involved, war was inevitable.
The response to an attack on Germany by Stalin depends on what Nazi Germany did after the non-aggression pact failed to be signed. If he had invaded Western Europe, Stalin would probably have attacked sometime in 1941, while Nazi forces were concentrated in France. In this scenario, the Soviet Union could A. declare war on both Poland and Germany, forcing the two of them into an alliance if they weren't already, B. make an alliance with Poland and declare war on Germany, or C. declare war on Poland first. If the Soviets declare war on both Poland and Germany, while Germany is still at war with the British, they would mostly be facing the Poles at first. They would fare only slightly better against the Soviets than they have against the Germans. When news of the Soviet invasion reached Hitler, he would try to make an immediate peace with the Allies. At this point, Winston Churchill, assuming he still comes to power in 1940, probably wouldn't accept a German peace at this point, and definitely wouldn't accept any kind of peace short of complete capitulation to British demands, which would include a complete German withdrawal from all foreign territory, including Czechoslovakia and Austria. But more likely, he would continue the war until Hitler was decisively defeated. In this event, we probably see the other nations of Eastern Europe quickly pick sides. If it looks like the Soviets will win, they will try to side with them. The Baltics are a toss-up in this scenario, but I see them falling to the Soviets the same way they did in our timeline, with the Soviets orchestrating coups in them before invading. We would probably see Europe divided something like this after the war, especially if the US gets involved. If, however, we see the Soviets declare war on both Germany and Poland without the Nazis invading Western Europe, we probably get something like Scenario 2. Poland and Germany are forced to be allies, and they probably try to get the rest of Eastern Europe to join with them. The Baltics would definitely side with the Germans and Poles, because any scenario that involves Poland being invaded is a threat to the Baltics, and they would cozy up to Germany for aid. This would also drag other anti-Comintern countries into the war as well, such as Japan, Manchukuo, and Hungary. Although Italy and Spain were both part of the anti-Comintern Pact, I don't see them holding up their end of the treaty obligations unless the Soviets start arming communist partisans within their borders.
I don't see the British or the Americans siding with the Soviets in this scenario. I also don't see them siding with the Nazis. At most, I can see both the US and UK governments allowing private manufacturers to continue selling weapons to either side. France, on the other hand, is a toss-up. If, however, the Soviets decide to make an alliance with Poland before the attack, there's going to have to be an exchange of territory.
The Soviets would likely demand that the Baltics be placed under Soviet control and that Poland cede some of its eastern territory to the Soviets. In exchange, the Soviets would let the Poles annex eastern Prussia, along with additional territory in eastern Germany. Germany would get overwhelmed and probably turned into a Soviet puppet state along with Czechoslovakia. Austria could also be left merged with Germany, or it might possibly secede from Germany before the Soviets arrive, thereby evading the same consequences. However, if they did, we would probably see a civil war in Austria between Nazis and communists, which would result in a communist victory. The one commonality in all of these scenarios is that the Soviet Union ends the war more powerful than it was before. Stalin's decision in our timeline made war inevitable in all of Europe, resulting in between 15 and 20 million deaths, the biggest chunk of which was in the Soviet Union itself. Had Stalin not signed the pact, not only would fewer people have died, but the Soviet Union itself would have come out of the war more powerful, In our timeline, Premier Khrushchev once said that by 1960 the Soviet Union still hadn't fully recovered from the war.
I would like to thank my patrons for helping make this video possible, along with this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Click the top link in the description for a free trial of Skillshare Premium. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.